Here, Hikaru had the black pieces and white was crafty, a chess engine playing this blitz game. And already you can see from Hikaru's first few moves what his anti-engine strategy is. Deliberately keeping the pawn structure very flexible. He's always making single pawn moves, and the reason is that anytime anyone makes a double pawn move, it gives a clear target for the opponent. It's a universal phenomenon in chess. I'll give you an example. If as white you play e4, black gets to decide whether or not to challenge it with d5, either in the Scandinavian or the French or the Caro-Kann or God forbid whatever this is called. Or conversely, if as black you play e5, you're leaving it up to white whether they want to play d4 at some point and go after this target. Or when you play the Sicilian, c5 becomes the target and they can similarly go for an open Sicilian or a wing gambit. So back to the real game. Anytime you make a double pawn move, you give the opponent the option on whether they want to attack it or not. You're letting them decide the pawn structure. So Hikaru may not have an objective advantage yet, but he has optionality. He gets to decide the future pawn structure of the game by keeping everything very flexible. And this game was back in 2007 when engines did not have a deep understanding of pawn structures. Now, after a few more moves, you may find this opening familiar. It's called the Hippo defense. And what I want you to notice is this two-pawn structure, known as a padlock pawn structure. So whenever you have two pawns side by side jutting out like so, your opponent can only attack one of those pawns at a time. There's no way to attack both the E and D pawns simultaneously with pawns. And as soon as a pawn trade is offered, black can decline it by pushing it. Or if you play D5, black can go E5. The same logic applies with the G and H pawns. If you go G5, I'll go H5, or H5, G5. Basically, Hikaru can guarantee a closed game if he wishes. And this ties back to my earlier point, which is that black can decide the pawn structure. Having the option to decide the pawn structure is a form of an advantage that the engines don't normally pick up on. Anyway, Crafty did not push this pawn. He retreated the bishop and then played queen to d2, attacking the h6 pawn. So Hikaru defended it with king to h7, and Crafty played d5, and e5 is the easy human move to play. And as far as all human chess masters are concerned, white is shooting itself in the foot with this move d5. And this is yet another good reason on why you want to play this anti-engine strategy, because engines simply don't understand the issue with white's position right now. And the issue is that black has an easy pawn chain pointing towards white's king, which means the plans for a pawn expansion on the king side will be extremely easy. In contrast, white does not have a pawn chain pointing towards black's king. So if in the future white tries to play an f4 pawn break without the pawn structure agreeing, then after e takes f4, this pawn becomes very weak, because there's no d pawn or f pawn able to defend it ever again on this half open file. And also, with this e pawn gone, black can make use of that square with, say, the knight. So this is the anti-engine strategy already at play. Most chess computers, especially those in 2007, did not understand these positional precepts. Continuing the game, white retreated the knight to vacate the f3 square and support this pawn in the middle. But then came f4, further strengthening the pawn chain towards the king. Now, I want to emphasize that whatever you see on h2 and g2, that pawn duo there does not count as a padlock. The reason is that the f3 pawn is fixed. So black at any moment can play their pawn up to g4, and there's no way that white can decline this pawn trade. And something I want to reiterate is that I'm not talking about what's good or bad objectively at the moment. I'm merely speaking in terms of optionality. Black can do this anytime they want at their convenience, whereas white, in contrast, has to be prepared against this at all times. Another thing to recognize with this space grab is that black is going to have a much better time with the kingside attack, because the conduit into white's king position for black is much wider than the way white's pieces could come into black's position. Anyway, after white saved the bishop, black began the expansion, and here Crafty played knight to d3, which isn't a good move because the knight doesn't actually do anything on this square, and on the contrary, it blocks white's light squared bishop from joining in on the defense when g4 is potentially played later. And here you can see another reason why closed positions help humans so much. Now, of course, assuming you're a human who is good at chess like Hikaru. Anyway, I'll play out one more move. And here it's good to stop and assess what black's best plan is. So when you want to assess the best plan in the opening, what you want to see is the nature of your advantage. Not counting really wild gambits or exposed kings, there are really only two types of advantages you can have in the opening. It's number one, space, and number two, development. In other words, if you compare your pawns versus your opponent's pawns, whose is better? That determines who has more space. Then next, you compare your pieces to your opponent's pieces. Whose is better? That determines who has better development. In this case, you can clearly see that Hikaru has better pawns and Crafty has better development. So the plans for white and black will be the opposite. Hikaru, with the space advantage, should take his time. The best plan for Hikaru is to play slowly and patiently, because having more space means that you have a bigger house in which you can maneuver around more freely than your opponent can. Behind these closed doors, black can spend the next 5 moves more productively than white can spend their next 5 moves. So that's black's best plan. Play patiently. White's best plan is the opposite. With better pieces, what white should be looking to do, if it was even possible, is to trade pawns. Because if you imagine, if these 2 layers of pawns were removed, material remains equal, but now you can see that black's king is in huge trouble. Because white is in a better position to take over the open files and use the newly opened diagonals for the bishops, for the rooks, for all their pieces to get to work. Whereas black's pieces are all sleeping on the first rank. So if your advantage is in piece activity, recognize that all the pawns in the middle are just concealing your real advantage. And that's why you see Hikaru play very patiently and postpone the pawn break. You can clearly see that Hikaru has improved his position more than white has improved their position with whatever this weird shuffle was. Now, despite having already made contact with white's pawn, Hikaru can still be considered playing patiently here. And the reason is that the pawns have made contact, but there's no meaningful way for white to open up the position in its favor. F takes g, h takes g changes nothing, because the absence of the h5 and f3 pawns don't actually give white any new tactical resources. So the position, despite this contact here, is still functionally closed. And Hikaru can take his time with moves like a6. Now there's actually 2 reasons why you want to play a6. The first is that you set up this padlock early. So anytime they try to open up the queen side, because remember, you want all the action to happen as black on the king side, and white is going to find counterplay on the queen side if they can't find any good defense on the king side. So white would really love to open up the queen side, and that's why this padlock is good for black. If you try to open up the position of a5, there's b5, and similarly, if b5, there's a5. Now the second reason you want to play a6 is you realize this bishop on c8 really likes this diagonal. The bishop, as far as I'm concerned, is already developed, despite being on the first rank, because this is such a good diagonal. The only problem I have with the bishop is that it's blocking this rook in. So d7 would be the ideal square for the bishop, but that gives white a chance to trade bishops earlier with bishop to b5. And that's why the move a6 comes in handy. You take away the b5 square ahead of time. So while the position remains closed, Hikaru continues to make small improvements to his position. And here, with rook to f7, Hikaru was probably preparing for a bit of a reshuffle for his pieces. Most likely his plan was to put his queen on h8 or eventually his rook and slide the king out, or maybe even both queen and rook. And then the king slides out to f8. Now that black's pieces are effectively on the frontier of the space they can get, Hikaru felt that it was time to open up the position. So g3, some pawns come off, and then h4. So Hikaru has sacrificed the pawn. He lost the f and g pawns in return for the h, but he has also gained a couple of squares. And the main squares that he has unlocked are the h4 square, h5, g3 and f4. All of which are great targets for the knights to use. They are in fantastic positions to occupy them. So here if Crafty had retreated the bishop, then immediately knight to h5, and the threats of knight g3, knight f4 are too much to stop. So instead of retreating, Crafty decided to give up the bishop. And the reason for giving up the bishop is by getting rid of the h4 pawn, you get access to g3. Now there's no pawn controlling that square. And with g3, you now regain control over those critical squares, h4 and f4, plus, with the g2 square vacated, this rook can swing over to h2. So basically, Hikaru sacrificed the pawn to get access to some of these squares, and then Crafty, in turn, sacrificed the bishop to regain control. So Hikaru now has the material advantage, and the priority now is to just consolidate and keep the channel to his king very narrow. Meaning you keep f4 at bay, because you don't want there to be 2 or even 3 open fouls towards your king. Remember that Crafty still has better development, whereas Hikaru needs some time to get these pieces out. And by the way, this is one of the things about beating chess engines. And that is, maybe if a chess engine eventually plays f4, the position will become open and a human chess player will struggle to find decent moves and lose the game, because there will be a very fierce attack and you need to calculate well to defend. But you don't actually need to know how to combat f4 concretely in the craziness of that open position. As the human chess player fighting the chessboard, you just have to play in such a way that f4 is not the best engine's choice. And in doing so, the position will remain closed and you don't need to calculate that much, and you can continue to play good moves easily. So that's why you see Hikaru mindful of maintaining control over f4. He doesn't need to know how to refute it, he just needs to make sure that it won't be the engine's top choice. So a bit of a reshuffle again. Hikaru's rook makes it to the h file, and then offers a trade. And now Hikaru has a second problem, and that is, he can't move his bishop or rook because they are tied to the defense of the a-pawn. And you really don't want to be moving the a-pawn and allowing the queen side to open up, because that's where white can find their counterplay. Again, white has better development. Black cannot afford to open up the position so much. So what he did after a couple of moves was queen to e8 to attack the a4 pawn, hoping that white resolves the pawn padlock. And sure enough, white did that. b5, a5. So now black's queen side is rock solid, and it's time to concentrate back on the king side. Here he vacated the g6 square, and as soon as knight h3 is played, Hikaru did not hesitate to trade off bishop for knight. In these very close positions, the knights are going to be way better because they can jump through the pawn structure and get to the other side, whereas bishops are going to be stuck behind the pawn chain. So after the trade, Hikaru continued his earlier plan, vacating g6 so that the queen can join, and finally trading off the last pair of rooks. And with the rooks gone, you can see how many of black's advantages are now accentuated. Black has the queen on the open file, whereas white does not. Black has the free and liberated dark square bishop, while white is trapped behind their own pawns. Last but not least, white has one knight, whereas black has two. So Hikaru now does a quick maneuver to put his knight on c5, where it shields the c7 weakness, it is the base of the pawn chain after all, and apply some pressure on a4. Now, if white ever tries to challenge this knight with knight d3, Hikaru can slowly get another knight to replace it. Such is the power of having two knights. Anyway, after much shuffling, Hikaru finally makes it into Crafty's position. And here, Hikaru postponed capturing on c3. He just didn't see any value to that pawn anyway. But regardless, white played queen to c4, which means that the c pawn is now stuck on the dark square, allowing bishop d2, and black picks up the pawn anyway, with a queen trade to boot. And since the queen trade, the a4 pawn is now hanging, so Crafty had to play bishop d1. And here, after a few more moves, white is about to put their knight on f5, so black was prepared to challenge it with knight to e7. And technique can be an annoying thing. It can be annoying to try to win positions that are winning but not quite won yet. So let's break down the plans into a few phases. The first thing you want to do is try to trade off knights. And you can do it by applying some pressure on these backward pawns, either f3 or a4. So here, one of the knights is already on a4. So Hikaru used the other knight to go after the f3 pawn. So white decided to trade it off. And the next thing to recognize is that all of white's pawns are on light squares, while both sides have two light square attackers and defenders. The bishop is not an attacker of white's pawns ever, since it will be roaming around on dark squares. So this bishop's duty is going to be trying to put white in zugzwang. So you can observe it right here. Hikaru chose f3 to be the weakness, where eventually it could possibly have a maximum of 2 attackers and 2 defenders. Now here Crafty played rook to g1 and just allowed this pawn to fall. But let's explore king to g2. What happens if it seems like we are at an impasse? We have 2 attackers and 2 defenders. So here black can make a waiting move with bishop h4, and this prevents the king from waiting around near the pawn. So the only waiting move white can play is bishop to d1, but then king to e3, and you see that white is in complete zugzwang, because whether the king or the bishop moves, white will lose control over the f3 pawn. Now, but that's not how the game went. As I said, Crafty didn't put up much resistance here and just went king g1 directly. And once the f3 pawn is gone, the g pawns and the e pawns would follow. And after the bishop trade, the rest of the game is easy. Now, you'll want to see the end of this because Hikaru continued to horse around, and in the meantime I'll tell you a story Hikaru wrote. He blogged about it on his website in the summer of 2008. So he said that he was in the midst of another stretch of tournaments, and finally, amid all the busyness, he found a free day where he could wander the streets of Montreal. And he was wandering around the mountains, and the atmosphere really struck him. It was the French language, the architecture, the cadence of life. And he reflected that Montreal felt uncannily like a slice of France. And yes, he loved the city for that very charm, but he admitted that, you know what, Montreal feels a little too close to Europe, a little too similar in the vibe to the environment where he spends most of his professional chess playing life. And that's why he couldn't really see himself staying in Montreal long term. In contrast, Vancouver had a calmer West Coast rhythm, so it seemed more fitting for him. Anyway, now that I say this story out loud, it's not as interesting as it sounded in my mind, but I figured that I'll at least try to give you something to listen to while you see 50 plus moves of Hikaru moving 6 knights around for this checkmate. He does it all the time on Twitch, and it's good to know that he has been doing it since at least 2007. But anyway, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and you learned something, please subscribe. But you don't have to turn on the bell icon. If you're subscribed and my videos don't make it to your feed, it probably means I made a bad video and that's my fault anyway. So that's it from me. See you in the next one.